So Arthur comes to us from Campolo, Middleton, and McCormick. He has presented other workshops for us. I think, Arthur, you did one on different entities, different structures, maybe one or two others. And he has a lot of experience. And today he's going to talk to us about navigating your commercial leases. So let me introduce Arthur. Arthur, if you want to say a few words, and then we can begin.
Great. Thank you, Ronnie. And, I just want to say with the Business Development Center, probably the biggest value that you have to the folks that connect with you is that you have a great amount of relationships in the business community where you can make introductions and give people the resources beyond just direct help to help them navigate, right? And it's always important for any business owner and operator to have the right advisory folks to help them, whether they have a problem or an issue or whether they just need advice. And so I think the Business Center for many years has been, a great resource to be able to connect people to the help and support that they need. And our office has been close with the Business Center to be a resource to help folks in the business community.
Thanks,
and
Arthur.
So I've been an attorney for going on 15 years now. I've been representing commercial landlords and tenants for a large portion of that time, and I've worked with folks that own shopping centers, office buildings, and helping them negotiate their leases with tenants. And I've worked with many tenants, large and small, to help them negotiate their leases as well as issues that come up from time to time. And so, I like to think I've seen it all, anything that's come up. At the same time, every situation is new and unique, and is something that I like to help with. And so today, what I want to talk about, which has been a very sort of interesting situation, especially this year, is dealing with commercial leases when the economy is a little bit turbulent, where we have significantly higher inflation rates than we've had in recent years. And it's really caused a lot of issues on several different fronts. One is that we're seeing a significantly increased rates of default, where businesses are not able to either pay their rent or are not able to sustain their operations. And so that creates issues where there's discourse and disputes between landlords and tenants. And we've also seen unique negotiations because it's unclear how long the economy will be in this current environment, how long inflation will maintain at a high rate of increase. And the thing that business owners are thinking about is, well, what do I need? I know what I'm paying today, but what am I going to be paying 3 years from now or 5 years from now? And how do I plan for that? And how do I address it? And landlords have similar issues where they need to plan for the future, making sure that tenants are able to pay the rents that they're agreeing to, while maintaining certain profitability from the real estate that they are leasing out. And so it's created just interesting negotiations where people are more focused on these issues, where it's not just about I need to operate my business. It's also about how do I manage my future expenses, my future obligations. And leases tend to be longer term agreements where it's not something you could just get out of early. So that's why this topic has been especially relevant over the last few months. And we thought it'd be a good idea to provide some information about what we're seeing, as well as how businesses can address and negotiate things today that will impact them years from now. I'll begin with a bit of an overview, and feel free at any time to, if anyone has a question, feel free to interrupt. I think if something pops in that you want to address right in the moment, I think it's helpful. And so, I certainly don't mind people chiming in. So, don't hesitate to take yourself off mute and ask a question or make a comment. I welcome those through the presentation. What is a commercial lease? It's essentially an agreement that allows a business tenant the right to occupy certain space, right? So, that's basic and most people have an understanding, but I thought it's important to kind of address it. It's something that's negotiated, it's on paper, and it's enforceable against both sides. So if landlord is not doing something that the lease requires it to do, the tenant is able to enforce that in court. And if tenant isn't doing something, the landlord is able to enforce it. So that's important to keep in mind because especially folks that are new to the to business operations and are operating a new business and startup, they need to think about the fact that oftentimes commercial leases are for a significant period of time. Most of the leases that we see tend to be from anywhere from 5 to 10 years, right? Where you're signing a document today as a tenant agreeing to rent a space for 10 years or 5 years, and part of that is having to pay rent for all that time. So it's something that is a major consideration, and often for many businesses, especially smaller businesses, it's a huge part of business cost and expense. Besides the cost of producing whatever the business produces, the lease payments tend to be a major part of what the business will be paying over years. And so making sure a tenant understands that point, and that it's not something that you could just get out of early or anything, is an important part of it. And again, the goal is, and thinking about this is understanding that this is a long-term commitment without the ability to get out easy. And so understanding all financial aspects of what a lease requires, both from the landlord and tenant side, is critical at the beginning, because a lot of times when people aren't focused on this, we get questions and you get calls all the time. People say, well, I didn't realize my lease required me to, pay this, or I didn't realize that, this will increase this way. And, the problem is once it's signed and finalized, certainly there's an opportunity to negotiate, but at the same time, the document is enforceable as written. And so keeping that in mind and understanding things up front and all aspects of it is a critical part. And that's where, attorneys and real estate brokers are really not just there to get the deal done. They are there as a resource to be able to explain things that may not be easily evident when negotiating a lease. And so relying on your support and service providers is really an important part of understanding all these different issues. So we'll get into some of the financial aspects of a lease, right? And leases tend to be long and complicated with a lot of language. And in most cases, you negotiate the document, you sign it, put it in a drawer, and hope to never look at it again. And it's something that you don't want to be relevant, because at the end of the day, if the tenant's paying their rent, the landlord is receiving their rent, everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing, the piece of paper is just a piece of paper to just have. When you have to take out the piece of paper and have to say, well, what did we agree on this, and why is this like this? That's when things can get a little tricky. So, the financial framework, typically has several components. Base rent is what everyone refers to as the rent that you have to pay as a tenant. And it's really, it's the amount that the tenant pays, and usually it's paid every month, that allows the tenant to continue to use the space. So again, as long as the rent payments are being made and the landlord is not interfering with the space, everybody's happy. Usually base rent is quoted in terms of per square foot. So, you know, understanding what the market looks like, and every region is different, right? So some areas have a higher per square foot rental market, some have lower. It really depends on the type of space. It depends on whether it's office or retail. It depends on, you know, whether it's wholesale or distributor type centers. You know, depending on the use of the space, the per square foot amount that it's going to cost to rent it will vary. So, you know, the use varies as well as the area. Some areas are more popular for office space. Some areas are more popular for retail and that type of space. And some areas are popular for warehousing, you know, and so making sure you're in the right area for your business is an important part of it. But, you know, depending on, you know, things like foot traffic for retail space, that will likely impact how much you're paying. So high, you know, for a retail business, high foot traffic areas tend to cost more. For areas that are a bit more remote for retail, maybe a little less. But again, it, you know, depends on what your business needs are and where you want to be for your operations. Typically, rent increases every year. Again, that's not, what I would refer to as a standard. It's just something that is common. It doesn't have to be this way. And, you know, increases could be every year. Increases could be every 2 years, every 5 years. We do many leases where sometimes there are no increases for 5 years, and then at the 5-year mark, there's a major increase of not just a couple of percent, but let's say 10 or 12%. So it really, again, depends on understanding your business needs and, you know, whether you want to have gradual increases that are sustained by business growth, or whether you want periods of flat rent that, you know, increases over time, but gives you the ability to, you know, ramp up over a number of years. And so taking that into consideration is, you know, an important part of going into a negotiation to understand what the preference is. From a tenant's perspective, and landlords tend to be, you know, flexible, but at the same time, you know, landlords have increased expenses that, you know, where, you know, they may prefer to have increases more, you know, more often than, let's say, you know, at a 5 or a 10-year mark. A second component of commercial leases when it comes to you know, payments is what I'm going to refer to as common charges. So most commercial leases have base rent and then a portion of landlord expenses that are reimbursed by the tenant, right? So not all leases are like that. Some are what's typically referred to as triple net, where it's just one flat amount and you're not thinking about you know, landlord's costs. And but most leases that we deal with tend to have this second component of common charges, where in addition to rent, the tenant is also paying a portion of landlord expenses. And this could be, you know, a number of different things. Insurance is very typical. Operating expenses are very typical, where, you know, landlords spend a certain amount of money to maintain the building, remove snow, do landscaping, repairs, cleaning, you know, all these different services that the building provides. And then depending on what that cost is to the landlord for the year, the tenant then reimburses the landlord for those expenses. And, you know, where the base rent is usually a set amount and increases are pre-negotiated and determined, common charges tend to be more fluid, where some years it may be more expensive for the landlord to maintain and operate the building. Some years it may be less. And so this amount tends to fluctuate, you know, with, you know, again, with typical annual increases, depending on what things cost out in the market. So understanding those two components is important to figure out what your for a tenant the expected out-of-pocket monthly amount will be. And things like common charges could be structured in a way where there is, more control over what you expect to pay, where, some leases we structure where, there are certain monthly estimates that the tenant pays with a true up at the end of the year when the actual amounts are known. Sometimes it's just a one-time annual payment. But again, it depends on whether, business is comfortable paying that in one shot, or whether the preference is to pay it over time. In my experience, businesses prefer to spread out the cost and have one, big payment that they're not, don't have a lot of information on going into it. So spreading it out and understanding, what the timing will be is important, because sometimes the landlord could say, or the lease would provide that, well, on 10 days notice, you have to pay a year's worth of common charges, right? And so some businesses simply are just not able to do that. And so making sure that whatever is agreed to aligns with the business needs, is important. And, the other thing that, from the tenant's perspective that some tenants want to do is to keep, to negotiate for capped amounts on these increases in common charges, right? So where a landlord may agree sometimes to not increase common charges by more than 5 or 7% year over year, to be able to, again, allow a tenant to manage what those expenses are, so that, a tenant isn't penalized for a year in which a landlord has major expenses. Now, those will be spread out over future years typically, but again, having control and management over what the out-of-pocket amount is an important part of negotiating a lease. Another financial component of a lease is construction costs. A lot of times, one of the things that's negotiated up front is the condition of the space and who is responsible for building it to a tenant's needs. Many landlords, to incentivize the tenant to take the space, will often agree to invest a certain amount of money into building the space to certain specifications, right? And every tenant, has their own needs and their own desire for how the space is broken out, how the rooms are set. What, some tenants need specialized things installed, and so understanding what the cost of that is and what the needs are upfront and early is a way that both sides can can find some common ground to get more value, right? So landlords will be willing to do the work at their cost, and tenant says, this is what I need. Another aspect of this is the improvement allowance concept. That's typically where the landlord, instead of taking on the responsibility to have to do the work, will often tell the tenant, look, you build the space the way you need it, the way you want it, the way you're comfortable, use your own people, and we'll pay you for having to do that up to a certain amount, right? So again, it's similar concept as the landlord doing the work, except for the landlord, sometimes it's easier to make a payment than have to take on a project that they have to manage and oversee. It's again another way to share responsibility for getting the space up and ready for operations. And this is also typically quoted as a per square foot type of payment. And it could be either milestone payments, whereas the tenant is doing work, the landlord is paying, certain amounts that it agreed to pay, or it could be a payment that's made once the work is complete. And so for a tenant, understanding, the project timeline, what the expenses would be, what the timing would be, what its needs are from a cash perspective, whether they would need the money on an ongoing basis, or whether they have the ability to fund the project before it's complete. So understanding all aspects of that is where things typically get negotiated. And again, there's a lot of flexibility. So the needs of both landlord and tenant are important, to to understand before going into a negotiation like this. And then the other key component to a lease negotiation from a financial perspective is renewals, right? So as I mentioned in the beginning, commercial leases are for a period of time, but what happens when that time runs out? So let's say where there's a 5-year lease, a lot of times what tenants want to negotiate for is a renewal option, where tenant decides at a certain point towards the end of the initial term whether they want to stay there longer, whether they want to stay beyond the, let's say the initial 5 years as an example. So the components of that, and this is a sort of a key part of what we're going to talk about on the inflation side, is what's a fair way to structure the renewal, right? So 5 years is not a not a short period of time, and so a lot of things could change in the economy between now and then. Property values tend to increase, but by how much? These things are hard to predict, and so being able to manage what the future renewal out-of-pocket expenses are is an important part of negotiating a lease. And renewals are structured in many different ways. One way is that the increases that were initially agreed to will continue beyond the initial term for the renewal term. So if let's say the rent goes up 3% every year during the initial term, it's not unusual for everyone to agree that if the tenant decides to stay there longer, that the rent will continue to increase at the same rates. At the same time, what that approach doesn't address is economic environment, right? And so over that period, rents could go up a lot. Or maybe rents could even go down, which has happened in some years. And so to address that, a lot of times what is negotiated is where the rent for renewal is readjusted in a way where it ties to an economic metric, and consumer price index is just one example. There are many others that landlords and tenants typically use, where there's a just an adjustment and a reset of what the rent is based on market conditions. So that's a good way to do it. But if, let's say, someone negotiated a lease 5 years ago and today they have to start their renewal, if all of a sudden it's based on the current either consumer price index or inflation index or anything else, all of a sudden there'll be a tremendous increase if you for a tenant if you're using the those metrics. And so this year, and especially next year, when this year's amounts will be used to to price those renewals, it's going to have a serious impact on tenants that may not have anticipated 5 years ago that they're going to be paying based on huge inflation rates this year. So that's something that is an impact and something to think about. And again, there's no one right way to do it, but having understanding that the market will impact the rent is an important part of it. Another way to do it is to use third-party appraisers, and then some prefer to do that. For smaller leases, this tends to be probably cost prohibitive, right? Because then you're either sharing the cost, or one side is paying for someone to come in and appraise the value of the space and the rent that is market. But again, paying somebody to do that tends to be expensive and not typical for smaller leases. And then sometimes what everyone agrees to is, the landlord will just decide what the rent is for the space based on what other spaces that the landlord owns are being rented for. Now, this is common in office buildings where there are many tenants, and it's not that difficult to establish what is a fair rate. At the same time, it takes control away from tenants to be able to negotiate it, where the landlord has the power to say, look, this is what I believe is reasonable, and so take it or leave it. That's something that tenants don't like, but it's a common way to do it, where there are many tenants on which to base what the market conditions are. And so going into the negotiation, it's important to understand what the perspectives are, right? And for a landlord, the goal is to maintain consistent profitability from their real estate, right? So, the goal is to keep tenants in the space. The goal is to keep the buildings occupied and making sure that that there's income coming out of those buildings. So when landlords push too hard and push for rents that are too high, it's something that tends to tip the scales in favor of tenants, where they either have to leave or they have to find another space. And so for a landlord, it's always important to have some sense of reasonableness to make sure the tenants that are agreeing to pay certain rent are actually able to do so. And for tenants, the goal is to managing what their out-of-pocket costs are going to be in operating their business and having as much control over that as possible. Where if the market is going crazy and the economy is a little bit unstable, having as little access and as little impact from that is an important part, for a tenant to be able to manage that. And so, at the time of inflation, the market tends to be impacted by it. And while inflation isn't new, it's been particularly relevant this year. And so, getting clarity on rent and rent increases is an important part of this. When there's some balance and equilibrium in the market, everybody, is able to perform their obligations. When things get out of balance, where landlords charge too high and tenants can't pay, or where tenants are below market rate, where the landlord is losing money, finding the balance on these issues is an important part of it, and understanding how inflation impacts all of that is an important part of these negotiations. So, to touch on inflation, and for those not familiar, inflation at a very basic level is the rate of increase of prices, prices over time. Simply put, it's how much the cost of things goes up over a period of time. So, to give some perspective, here's kind of the last 10 years and where the inflation rate has been. So every year, these amounts have been the increases of, year over year of what things tend to cost. And so as you can see, 2021 saw an increase that was, higher than normal, where in 2022, and, it's expected to roll into 2023, the increase has almost doubled over last year. In some cases, is 6 or 7 times what it's been over the last decade. And so, it impacts, the biggest impact of all of this is that things cost more, right? So the money that businesses are spending, the money that it costs to operate doesn't go as far as we're used to, because the prices of things are higher, while the income and everything else, is not growing at the same pace. And so, it's affecting operations, and it's certainly affecting how leases are negotiated. And specifically, the impact on real estate is, has been pretty typical with how inflation moves and changes. Where, with higher inflation rates, the value of real estate actually tends to go up. The reason for that is because it's the price of money, right? So how much it costs in interest rates to borrow to be able to buy new buildings, to be able to build and develop new buildings is higher, which means that there's less of it. And so anyone who owns a building or operates is able to charge more because there are less buildings coming into the market and becoming available. And so, it actually helps property owners during time of inflation because the value of their buildings increase, but the impact on tenants is very significant because now tenants have to pay higher rents. And so it creates, again, this disbalance that we haven't seen over the last decade, in lease negotiations, because landlords are able to now charge more, and they have to do so. Otherwise, they're not able to get the value out of their spaces because it's costing them to do more, to pay for maintenance, to pay for service and stuff like that. And so, it's kind of, the market just naturally pushes these things forward. So, during times of high inflation, tenants tend to prefer longer term leases where they have agreements as to what they're going to pay over time. So, in other words, if I could agree today that over the next 10 years, my rent is only going up 2%, I'm able to, as a tenant, manage what my future business expenses will be. And of course, for landlords during this period of time, the opposite is preferential, where landlords would sometimes rather get a new tenant in every 2-3 years, where they're able to adjust for higher rent based on what the market is showing, right? So it creates this negotiated scenario where the interests are not aligned, where the goal of the negotiation then is to find other common ground to be able to reach some agreement and understanding.
Arthur, can I just ask you one thing about that?
Yeah, of course.
Why is there lower supply? Because landlords who want to buy buildings can't get the funding, can't get the money to do it? Or why you think that there'd be more? You think that there'd be an overabundance of properties because people couldn't pay the rent and they're leaving?
So that's been happening, but the bigger issue tends to be that with higher cost of building new buildings and the higher cost of buying new buildings, existing property owners are just holding on to what they have, right? Mm-hmm. So there isn't as much new property that's becoming available.
But there's so much.
It tends to. The market gets smaller as to what's available. Now, to your point, yes, when the effect of that is potentially that there will be more defaults and more spaces becoming available as tenants are unable to pay it, but that doesn't happen overnight, right? So it does happen, but the supply of available space tends to not increase at the pace that businesses are looking for space, and so it's driving up prices.
Okay, and yet I'm sorry to pursue this point, but you look at all the supermarkets that are going out and the malls and all this those kinds of spaces. I mean, what about that? What's going to happen with all those spaces? I know some of them. I heard that the Sears down by the Smith Haven Mall is being taken over by Stony Brook because their rents were too costly on the Belmead and that tech park area over there. And they're moving some of that over to the Sears, but there are so many supermarkets that are left empty. I don't understand why why landlords haven't figured out a way to break up the space and make maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, well, yeah, and look, I mean, you bring up a great point, right? And I would put retail space into sort of a separate category, right? Because regardless of what's happening with inflation, retail for a number of years now, even starting before the pandemic, but really sort of exacerbated by the pandemic, has affected, how much people are going out and buying things in person at stores. And so retailers have been tremendously impacted, and, many have defaulted. Some have, gone into bankruptcy. For example, Toys R Us had over 1,000 stores when they went under. and some of those spaces are still sitting there, available for rent that nobody's taking. And so, it's a different perspective and a different type of market where the retail space is, not as impacted by inflation necessarily, but is driven by other market conditions that are impacting the demand, right? So the demand for retail space is actually going down, which whereas for for office space, the demand has been going up actually, and so to your point,
even with all the offices being vacated and people are working from home, office space, the need for office going up.
Right. What I'm seeing directly is businesses, some have consolidated their office space, but many have really been expanding because even though people working from home, I think long-term vision is that the work from home environment is not sustainable over a long period of time, right? And so we've had many businesses take advantage of opportunities to increase their space, to spread people out more, to offer new and different facilities to entice people to come work, because as everyone in business understands, it hasn't been easy getting labor over the last few years, and so many offices are actually looking to expand to be able to offer more comfortable work settings, as an incentive to be able to hire folks. And so and I work with many office building landlords, and they haven't seen necessarily a slowdown in the number of tenants that they have. So sometimes they do have to negotiate for better rent and stuff like that, but the office buildings are generally pretty have low vacancy rates right now, but certainly to your point, retail has been affected by what the retail market is, and people obviously buying things more online, and the business is just not being able to support those rents. So just to kind of move this through, here's some ideas and some things to think about, when negotiating and a lease, and making sure that businesses managing market risk. So understanding the local real estate market and rates is critical, right? So knowing what the rents are in the area, what going back to different classes of office buildings, where let's say a Class A building could cost $30 a square foot, a Class B building could cost $24 a square foot for office space. And so every business has its own needs, and some businesses require a higher end office space. Some are able to get by, especially early on, with lower quality space, but where it suffices for their building. So being able to understand the market and negotiate to control as much of the lease from the tenant's perspective as you can is an important part of it. And the other point is to keep dialogue with the landlord, right? So tenants often just go about their business, don't focus on what they have to pay, and then all of a sudden, like, oh crap, these are huge payments that we're making on the rent. So have a conversation, pick up the phone. Being able, landlords, while having their own obligations, they do tend to be flexible sometimes, where their goal, again, as a reminder, is to keep tenants in the space and paying rent. So when there's an issue, it's not uncommon for a landlord to be reasonable, where it's like, look, hey, my business is in its down season right now, I'm having a little trouble paying rent, so is there something we could do for today that where I'll make it up during my busy season? And those conversations and having those dialogue and being able to ask those questions is important, and maintaining that relationship with the landlord is a critical part of it. And then the other side of it is find additional value. There are other things besides rent that are an important part of a lease. So sometimes a tenant will have value where they'll pay a little more, but they'll get some improvements out of it. They'll pay less for the short term, but agreed to extend the lease for a longer period of time to be able to stay there down the road, where it gives landlord more certainty in the future. Negotiating renewal options, expansion rights, so to be able to go into, you know, more space if it becomes available. You know, all these different things are ways to create value for both sides, where it's not just about, you know, the check that is cut on the first of every month. And you know, exploring and finding, you know, common ground on these things can get both sides more value out of the lease. And then, you know, it would be a mistake not to address what happens in a scenario where someone just can't pay their rent, right? And whether it's because the rent's too expensive, or whether it's because the business is not doing well. And so understanding what happens in those scenarios is an important part of entering into a new lease. You know, what happens when the lease ends, or what happens if you don't pay rent? So when a tenant defaults by not paying rent, landlord typically has, you know, fairly broad rights. They can terminate the lease. They could commence proceedings to have a tenant removed from a space. And, you know, that's been, you know, also a very messy situation last few years, because the courts haven't been doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so where it used to take a commercial landlord 3 to 4 months to be able to get to remove a non-paying tenant, right now we're seeing that time period go to, you know, 8 to 10 months sometimes. Now, you know, it happens eventually, and if the tenant is using the space and not paying for it, you know, ultimately the landlord will be able to recover that amount if there are assets. But you know, the courts and the slowdown that we've seen has, you know, impacted negotiations as well, because tenants now know and have leverage in the negotiation that, hey, look, landlord, you're not going to be able to get me out in 2-3 months like you used to. So how about we cut a deal now and I'll pay less? And, you know, it really provides leverage for negotiating when when tenants understand what the legal framework looks like. And just, you know, for a landlord, there's no obligation to mitigate its damages, right? So landlords, if they're comfortable that the business tenant will be able to pay their rent at some point, even if they're not paying today, landlord isn't required to find another tenant. They're not required to really do anything, where they could just sit back and wait until the court orders the tenant to make the payment. And then the tenant's typically on the hook for everything, including unpaid rent, cost, expenses, and anything else that may be relevant. And then the other thing to think about at lease exit is alterations in the condition of the space that is presented at the end, because sometimes it costs a lot of money to take things out that were installed early on. And then just to quickly touch on personal guarantees. So the, you know, personal guarantees are part of many commercial leases where, especially where it's a brand new business, doesn't have a proven track record of operations, where the individual business owner or even multiple business owners are personally responsible, where it's not just the entity. And so, you know, provides landlord with more protection. And from a tenant's perspective, it's very common to negotiate what's called the good guy guarantee instead of just a full obligation and guarantee for everything, where as long as the tenant gives possession back to the landlord, the individual is off the hook. Now, the business entity would still be responsible for the remainder of the term, but at least the individual owner can walk away with their personal assets intact if they give the space back to the landlord. So it's a, you know, common way to give the business owner some you know, some ability to manage their personal risk, while giving the landlord some protection where they'll at least have some period of time when the individual is responsible. So that's pretty much it. You know, I tried to cover, you know, several of these topics to give some perspective. Certainly these go way deeper than what we're talking about today, but, you know, and I'm happy to, you know, answer any questions or talk about anything else that anybody has. My contact information is here. So, you know, feel free to reach out anytime. And if anybody has any questions right now, feel free to ask.
Oh, we certainly do.
We do. Go ahead,
Okay,
Les.
yeah, thanks. Mike had to leave, but Jackie asks, how do we find zoning information? She needs a space for manufacturing. And then we have another question after that.
Right. So zoning is extremely regional. You know, the best starting point, I would typically, you know, when someone comes to us and say, you know, this is the type of business I'm looking to start, or I'm looking to operate, or I need space for something like this, you know, typically real estate brokers have, you know, pretty good familiarity with zoning. Zoning could be town-based, zoning could be county-based. And so, you know, there's a lot of different things that go into that. And so depending on what the needs are in the area, you know, even within a certain town, you know, certain parts of it could be zoned for certain things. At the same time, you know, there are mechanisms and procedures for, you know, updating and getting permission for special use and stuff like that. So a lot goes into it, but you know, I would start with a broker that knows the area and could say, you know, what parts are zoned for what, but, you know, it comes down to town code a lot of times.
And the other one is actually a two-parter. Is it the tenant's responsibility to replace a roof? And then also, is a lease for less than 1 year under the same obligations as a 5+ year lease?
All right, so the question, the roof question typically depends on the type of building that we're talking about. So landlords that lease a full standalone building will often look to pass 100% of the responsibilities to the tenant for full operational expenses, full repairs and everything, right? So, you know, where, you know, it's one building, one tenant, a lot of times the landlord will say, all right, tenant, you're going to be responsible for everything. At the same time, there are, even in those scenarios, situations where landlords don't want to pass along that obligation, but they may pass along that cost, right? Where landlord wants to have their own people doing things like repairing the roof, because roofs tend to be very particular. Any penetration in the roof can cause a problem. It impacts warranties. And so, you know, it really depends on the situation. But for multi-tenant buildings or shopping centers, almost all the time, and I don't want to say, you know, all the time 100%, but I would say most of the time, the roof and structural repairs and shared systems like plumbing and other things that are outside the space, those are typically the landlord's responsibility. But as I mentioned, with the common charges, the costs of doing that will typically be passed along to tenants. And then the other question about the term, Leslie, can you repeat that question again, the second part of it?
Is a lease for less than 1 year under the same obligations as a 5+ year lease?
I would say in the commercial realm, for the most part, the answer is yes. Typically, it is on the business tenant to maintain and repair everything in their space. Anything outside their space is usually not the tenant's responsibility, but whether it's 1 year or 5 years or 10 years, the responsibilities tend to be the same, right? So for shorter term leases, one of the things we typically like to negotiate for is, you know, a limit on what the repairs are. So for example, if a short term lease has tenant responsible for all maintenance and repairs in the space, and one of those things is a dedicated HVAC unit that services the space, you know, sometimes that could cost thousands of dollars to replace, where, you know, someone who's renting a space for a year or two wouldn't want to incur that cost, but those are the things that are negotiated, right? So, you know, on short-term leases, you may want, you know, you may be able to negotiate out of having the full obligations for every single thing in the space that has to be maintained or repaired. All right. Anybody else? Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
She's just
Yeah, Jackie.
Just getting started.
Jackie wants to know any thoughts on lease to own commercial properties.
Sure. I mean, you know, we've done some deals like that. You know, it depends on the building a lot of times. You know, from the perspective of the building owner, you know, it's not the best deal if they're locked into having to sell to a certain tenant, you know, in the future at today's rate, because a lot of times when you're negotiating a lease to sell, you're essentially setting the purchase price today for something that will be paid down the road. And so, long-term arrangements like that typically don't tend to work well unless there's some sort of purchase price adjustment. But anytime there's any sort of adjustment, it creates an opportunity for new negotiations and everything else. And so, it's doable, but not very common, because there are just too many variables for what the future will look like, and building owners don't want to lock themselves in to have to do a deal, instead of today, some years from now.
Mhm. I have a ton of questions, but I'll not ask them all.
Unless anybody else, or is that everything? Sorry, I'm not watching the chat, so
No.
Okay,
I think we're done.
okay, very good.
I think we're
All right,
done.
well, I appreciate everybody's attention and time. Hopefully
Great.
people found this useful. And again, feel free to reach out with any follow-ups or questions. Phone or email is convenient. So anytime.